March 15, 1993. Sergeant Miguel Ramirez had been working the Juarez checkpoint for 8 months. He'd seen every kind of smuggler, every type of lie. But the kid in the Mercedes with the gold chains? That was different. The kid offered him $10,000 cash, said his name like it should mean something. When Mig laughed and reached for his handcuffs, the kid smiled and said 5 words that would haunt him forever. "You have no idea who I am." Mig beat him unconscious, threw him in a holding cell for 3 days, fed him nothing but water and stale bread, then handed him over to the Mexicans like any other border jumper. 28 years later, when the ransom video arrived, Mig finally understood. The beaten kid was El Chapo, and he'd been planning his revenge ever since. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Rivera's hands shook as he held the photograph, the glossy surface slick with his sweat. His granddaughter Sophia smiled back at him from the image, bound, gagged, terror flooding her brown eyes. Behind her, a concrete wall bore the fresh spray-painted words, "Remember me?" The doorbell of his cramped El Paso apartment had rung at 11:47 p.m. No courier, just an envelope slipped under the door like a death sentence. Inside, the photo and a burner phone that had buzzed once since he'd found it. He hadn't answered. Couldn't. Not yet. 23 years of trying to forget that night in Laredo, and it all came rushing back with surgical precision. The weight of the baton in his grip, the wet sound it made against bone, the kid's blood on the checkpoint floor, black under the fluorescent lights. Rivera had told himself it was just another smuggler, another punk who thought he could disrespect American authority. He'd been so goddamn wrong. The apartment walls seemed to close in around him. Faded military citations hung crooked on peeling paint, reminders of the man he used to be before that night destroyed everything, before Congressman Martinez called Washington, before the investigations, before they stripped him of his rank and threw him out like garbage. Sophia's backpack still sat by the front door where she'd dropped it yesterday after school, pink and purple, covered in patches from bands he'd never heard of. She'd been complaining about her history teacher, something about a test she wasn't ready for. Normal teenager problems. The kind of problems he'd give anything to worry about right now. The burner phone buzzed again. This time, Marcus answered. "You remember now, don't you, soldier?" The voice was calm, cultured. No trace of the frightened boy who'd tried to cross with a truck full of cocaine hidden in engine parts. "You remember how you made me kneel in my own blood while your friends laughed? Where is she?" Marcus's voice came out as a whisper. "Safe, for now. But we need to discuss your debt. You see, Sergeant Rivera, or do you prefer Mall Security Guard Rivera? That night you cost me more than my dignity. That shipment you seized was worth $12 million. Money that belonged to some very unforgiving people." Marcus closed his eyes. He'd known the bust was big, but 12 million? No wonder the kid had fought so hard. No wonder he'd spat in Marcus's face when the cuffs went on. "I was a soldier. I was doing my job." "Your job?" Laughter, cold and sharp. "Your job was to check papers and wave traffic through. Instead, you decided to play hero. You know what happened to me when I went back empty-handed? What they did to my family? The war that started because of your job?" The line went quiet except for breathing. Marcus could hear machinery in the background, industrial sounds that could be anywhere in the sprawling borderlands. "Hundreds died in that war, soldier, including someone very close to you." Marcus's blood turned to ice. "What are you talking about?" "Your daughter, Carmen. Sweet girl. Shame about her habit. Tell me, where do you think that fentanyl-laced heroin came from? The batch that killed her 3 years ago?" The phone slipped from Marcus's grip, clattering to the linoleum. Carmen's face flashed through his mind, not as she was at the end, hollow-eyed and skeletal, but as the bright-eyed little girl who used to wait by the window for him to come home from deployment. The daughter who'd overdosed in a Juarez hotel room while he was pulling double shifts at the mall, trying to keep Sophia in private school. He picked up the phone with trembling fingers. "You son of a bitch. Careful, soldier. I have your granddaughter, remember? And unlike you, I don't make the same mistake twice. This time, I'm not some scared kid with fake papers. This time, I own half of Mexico and have enough money to make people disappear without a trace. What do you want? Justice. 23 years late, but justice all the same. You humiliated me, cost me everything, killed my cousin in the war that followed. So now you'll know how it feels to lose everything you love, piece by piece. The phone went dead. Marcus sat in the darkness of his apartment, surrounded by the debris of his ruined life. Outside, El Paso slept, unaware that one of the world's most wanted men was somewhere in their city, settling a score that had been brewing since the Clinton administration. He thought about calling the FBI, the DEA, hell, even the local police. But they'd want evidence, explanations, time to build a case. Sophia didn't have time. The old soldier in him, the part that 3 years of mall security hadn't killed, began to surface. He'd made one mistake 23 years ago. He'd let Joaquin Guzman walk away alive. Before we continue this deadly game of cat and mouse tomorrow, drop a comment below telling us where you're reading from tonight. And if Marcus's impossible choice has you hooked, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice and revenge. Marcus Rivera sat motionless in his threadbare recliner, the dead phone still clutched in his weathered hands. The apartment's silence pressed against his eardrums like deep water. Outside, the neon sign of the Sunset Motel across the street flickered red-blue-red, casting kaleidoscope shadows across the water-stained ceiling he'd stared at countless nights since Carmen's funeral. 3 a.m., the witching hour when all his ghosts came calling. He forced himself to his feet, joints protesting with the familiar ache of a body that had seen too many wars, both foreign and domestic. The hardwood floor creaked under his weight as he moved to Sophia's bedroom door, left ajar the way she always kept it. "For air circulation, abuelo," she'd say. Though he knew it was really because the dark still frightened her sometimes, even at 17. Her bed was made, pink comforter pulled tight with military precision. He'd taught her that. Old habits from a life when making your bunk correctly might mean the difference between punishment and praise, between respect and ridicule. Now it seemed cruel, forcing a teenage girl to live by the rigid standards that had shaped and ultimately destroyed him. Her dresser held the archaeology of a young life, honor roll certificates, photos with friends, a participation trophy from freshman volleyball. In the center sat the silver frame he'd given her last Christmas, Carmen at age 16, laughing at something beyond the camera's reach. Mother and daughter had shared the same eyes, the same stubborn tilt to their chin when they thought he was being unreasonable. Marcus picked up the frame, studying Carmen's face. Had she been thinking about drugs even then? Had he missed the signs, too consumed with his own shame and bitterness to notice his daughter's pain? The questions that had plagued him since her death now carried fresh venom. El Chapo's words echoed, "Where do you think that fentanyl-laced heroin came from?" 23 years. A thread connecting that brutal night in Laredo to his daughter's death in a Juarez hotel room. He'd thought he was protecting America's borders. Instead, he'd set in motion a cascade of violence that had eventually claimed his own blood. The apartment held the accumulated weight of his failures. In the kitchen, Sophia's cereal bowl still sat in the sink from yesterday morning, Lucky Charms dried to multicolored concrete. She'd been rushing for the bus, complaining about her history test, about her friend Melissa's boyfriend drama, about the normal teenage catastrophes that now seemed precious as gold. "I'll see you tonight, abuelo," she'd called over her shoulder, backpack bouncing as she hurried down the hallway. "And you better not eat all the ice cream while I'm gone." He'd grunted something about not making promises he couldn't keep, still half asleep with his coffee. If he'd known it was the last normal moment they'd share, would he have said something different? Told her he loved her? Held on just a little longer? Marcus opened the freezer, staring at the half-empty container of mint chocolate chip, Sophia's favorite. He'd bought it Tuesday on his way home from the mall, thinking of her smile when she found it waiting. Such small gestures were all he had left to offer. A man who'd once commanded respect from hardened soldiers now measured his worth in surprise ice cream and helping with algebra homework. The Westfield Mall where he worked was a dying monument to American commerce, populated more by teenagers killing time than actual shoppers. He walked those polished floors 8 hours a day, radio clipped to his belt, keys jangling with hollow authority. The other guards were younger men, ex-cops and wannabe heroes who treated him with careful politeness that felt worse than outright dismissal. "You doing okay, Marcus?" they'd ask, voices heavy with pity. They knew his story, the disgraced soldier playing security guard, raising a granddaughter because his daughter couldn't stay clean long enough to be a mother. But they didn't know about that night in Laredo. They didn't know that the scared kid he'd beaten bloody had grown up to flood American cities with poison. They didn't know that every overdose death in El Paso carried his fingerprints. Every grieving parent was mourning his choices. The apartment's walls were thin. Mrs. Hernandez next door had her television turned up loud. Some late-night telenovela where beautiful people destroyed each other in Spanish. Through the bedroom wall he could hear old Mr. Kim's oxygen machine wheezing its mechanical rhythm. Normal sounds from normal lives, people dealing with normal problems. Marcus envied them. He returned to the living room, to the photograph of Sophia still lying face up on the coffee table. Her terror-filled eyes stared back at him, silent accusation and desperate plea wrapped in glossy paper. In the corner of the image, barely visible, was part of a concrete wall marked with gang symbols he didn't recognize. She was somewhere out there in the sprawling darkness of the borderlands, afraid and alone, paying the price for his sins. The old soldier stirred again in his chest, not the broken man who'd shuffled through 3 years of exile, but the warrior who'd once believed in justice, in protecting the innocent, in doing what was right even when the cost was everything. 23 years late, Marcus Rivera was finally going to war. The burner phone rang at exactly 4 a.m., jarring Marcus from his cold preparation. He'd been cleaning his service pistol, a Sig Sauer P226 he'd kept hidden behind loose drywall in the bedroom closet. His hands moved with muscle memory as he reassembled the weapon. Each click of metal on metal a small prayer for Sophia's safety. "Did you sleep well, soldier?" The voice was different this time, younger, American accent with traces of Texan drawl. Marcus felt his chest tighten. El Chapo was using local talent now, people who could move freely through El Paso without raising suspicion. "Let me talk to Sophia. She can't come to the phone right now. Sleeping. Poor thing cried herself out around midnight, kept asking for her abuelo." The voice carried casual cruelty, like discussing the weather. "But don't worry, we're taking good care of her, for now." Marcus gripped the phone harder. "What do you want?" "My employer has a task for you. Consider it. Community service. There's a man in your city who's been causing problems for our organization. Detective Ray Vasquez, EPPD Narcotics. You know him?" The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Ray Vasquez, Carmen's first boyfriend back in high school. The good kid who'd wanted to be a cop since he was 12, who'd held Carmen's hand at Marcus's retirement ceremony after the Laredo incident. The same Ray who'd found Carmen's body in that Juarez hotel room 3 years ago, who'd sat in this very apartment afterward, tears streaming down his face as he apologized for not being able to save her. "I know him." "Good. Detective Vasquez has been very persistent about disrupting our supply chains. Cost us 2 safe houses last month, seized 40 kilos of product, arrested some valuable associates. My employer feels it's time for the detective to retire from police work, permanently." The apartment walls seemed to pulse with Marcus's heartbeat. "You want me to kill a cop? I want you to eliminate a threat to our business interests. What you call it is your choice." The voice paused, letting the words settle. "And before you start thinking about alternatives, about calling your friend to warn him, remember that we have eyes everywhere. Detective Vasquez's house on Rim Road, his daughter's dance recital this Saturday, his wife's nursing shift at University Medical Center. One phone call from you, one hint that you're not fully committed to our arrangement, and your granddaughter starts losing fingers." Marcus closed his eyes, seeing Ray as he'd been 25 years ago, earnest, idealistic, holding Carmen's hand like she was made of spun glass. Even after Carmen's descent into addiction, even after their relationship ended, Ray had never stopped checking on her, trying to help. He'd been the one to call Marcus when Carmen missed her court date, the one who'd driven him to identify the body. "There's more," the voice continued. "My employer thought you should understand the full scope of your situation. That photograph we sent? That was just the appetizer." The phone speaker crackled, Then a new voice came on, older, accented, unmistakably the same man who'd called hours earlier. "Hello again, soldier. I have something that belongs to you." Marcus heard rustling, then Sophia's voice, thick with tears and terror. "Abuelo? Abuelo, please help me. I don't know where I am. I can't—" The line went silent. "She's a beautiful girl," El Chapo's voice returned. "Reminds me of her mother at that age. Such a shame what happened to Carmen. Such a waste of potential." A pause, heavy with malice. "But history doesn't have to repeat itself. You have 48 hours to complete your assignment. Bring us Detective Vasquez's badge as proof, and Sophia comes home safely. Fail, and she'll follow her mother's path, though much more quickly, and with considerably more pain." "You bastard." "The same hotel room, soldier. The same needle. My men are already measuring the dose." The voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. 48 hours. Don't disappoint me again." The line went dead. Marcus sat in the pre-dawn darkness, the phone trembling in his grip. Through the walls he could still hear Mrs. Hernandez's television, Mr. Kim's oxygen machine, the distant hum of traffic on I-10. Normal sounds from a world that no longer existed for him. They wanted him to kill Ray Vasquez, the closest thing to a son he'd ever had. The man who'd loved Carmen when she was still pure, who'd held Marcus together when she died, who was now risking his life every day to stop the flow of poison across the border. Marcus Rivera had spent 23 years learning to live with his mistakes. Now he had 48 hours to choose between saving the girl he loved more than his own life or destroying the last good man who still believed Marcus Rivera had been worth knowing. The war he'd declared was about to claim its first casualty. The only question was which side of his soul would survive the killing. Marcus stared at the dead phone until the numbers on its cracked display blurred together. 48 hours. The deadline hammered against his skull like artillery fire, each second ticking away another piece of Sophia's life. He set the phone on the coffee table next to her photograph, his hands moving with the mechanical precision of a man trying not to think. This wasn't happening. Couldn't be happening. El Chapo was in prison, ADX Florence, the most secure facility in America. Marcus had seen the news coverage of his conviction, had felt a dark satisfaction knowing the bastard would rot in a concrete box for the rest of his miserable life. This had to be someone else, some pretender using Guzman's name to settle an unrelated score. But the voice knew too much. The checkpoint incident, Carmen's death, details that had never made the news, facts that only someone with intimate knowledge of both tragedies could possess. Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the kitchen window that overlooked the Sunset Motel's crumbling parking lot. A prostitute argued with her John by a rusted pickup truck, their voices carrying through the thin glass. Drug dealers worked the corner by the 7-Eleven. Teenagers barely older than Sophia selling death in plastic baggies. This was his neighborhood, now, his world. A place where decent people locked their doors after dark and children learned to recognize the sound of gunfire before they could tie their shoes. Maybe he could run. Take what little money he had saved, disappear into the vast anonymity of America. But they'd found him here, in this forgotten corner of El Paso. They knew about Sophia's school, her routines, his work schedule. Running would only delay the inevitable and guarantee her death. The rational choice was obvious. Call the FBI. Report the kidnapping. Let trained professionals handle what was clearly beyond his capabilities. But 23 years of watching bureaucracy grind good intentions into dust had taught him better. By the time federal agents finished their jurisdictional pissing contest and asset allocation meetings, Sophia would be another statistic in the war on drugs. His phone, his real phone, sat on the kitchen counter where he'd left it charging. He could call Ray, warn him, but the voice had been clear about surveillance, about consequences for deviation from their plan. And what would he say? That the most wanted fugitive in Mexico was personally orchestrating a revenge plot against a small-town cop? Ray would think he'd finally snapped, that grief and isolation had driven him insane. Marcus pulled out his wallet, counting the crumpled bills inside. $87. His checking account held maybe 300 more, a fortune compared to his neighbors, poverty compared to what he'd need for any kind of rescue operation. The old soldier's mind began calculating anyway. Weapons, transportation, surveillance equipment. All the tools he'd need to wage a one-man war against a drug cartel. The absurdity of it hit him like a physical blow. He was 58 years old, arthritic, out of shape. His last combat experience had been Desert Storm, against an enemy that wore uniforms and followed Geneva Conventions. These people skinned their enemies alive and posted the videos online for entertainment. But Sophia's face in that photograph burned behind his eyelids. The terror in her voice during that brief, cruel phone call. She was 17, still believed the world was fundamentally fair, that good people would protect her from monsters. She didn't know that sometimes the monsters won, that sometimes good people were just broken men pretending to be heroes. The apartment felt smaller with each passing minute, walls closing in like a coffin. He needed air, space to think. Marcus grabbed his keys and headed for the door, then stopped. What if they were watching? What if leaving triggered some predetermined response? Another demonstration of their reach. Paranoia crept up his spine like ice water. The old Korean War veteran next door could be reporting his movements. Mrs. Hernandez's nephew, who visited every Tuesday, might be taking photographs. The maintenance man who'd fixed his sink last month could have planted listening devices. Marcus forced himself to breathe, to think clearly. This was exactly what they wanted. Fear, isolation, the creeping certainty that he was completely alone. Classic psychological warfare, textbook intimidation tactics he'd studied in officer training decades ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. 23 years ago, he'd been the one wielding fear as a weapon, using his authority to break down a young smuggler's resistance. Now, the tables were turned, and that same broken boy had grown into something infinitely more dangerous than Marcus had ever been. His reflection stared back from the black television screen. Gray hair, deep lines, eyes that had seen too much and saved too little. This was what defeat looked like, a man in his bathrobe at dawn, holding a phone that delivered death sentences, surrounded by the wreckage of choices that had seemed righteous at the time. The clock on the microwave read 4:47 a.m., 43 hours and 13 minutes remaining. Marcus remained frozen by the microwave's green glow, watching precious seconds dissolve into the darkness. 43 hours. The number felt both infinite and impossibly brief. Enough time to plan a dozen different rescues, not enough to execute any of them successfully. He moved to the kitchen table where Sophia's school books still lay scattered from Tuesday night's homework session. Her history textbook was open to a chapter about World War II, yellow highlighter marking passages about resistance movements in occupied territories. The irony cut deep. Here was his granddaughter studying heroes who'd fought impossible odds against overwhelming evil, while her grandfather stood paralyzed by the very real evil that had swallowed her whole. A loose page had fallen from her notebook, covered in her careful handwriting, an essay about family legacy, about how her grandfather had served his country with honor, how his sacrifice at the border had protected innocent people from dangerous criminals. The teacher had written a plus in red ink at the top, along with a note, "Beautiful tribute to a family hero." Marcus crumpled the paper in his fist, then smoothed it out again. Sophia believed in him, still saw him as the hero he'd pretended to be for her entire life. She didn't know about the nightmares that woke him at 3 a.m., sweating and gasping. Didn't know that her mother's death had sent him to the bottle for 6 months, until Mrs. Hernandez found him unconscious on the bathroom floor and threatened to call child services. The truth was a cancer he'd carried for 23 years, growing larger and more malignant with each passing day. That night in Laredo hadn't been about duty or justice or protecting America's borders. It had been about rage, pure, undiluted rage at a system that was promoting less qualified officers over him, at a wife who died of cancer while he was deployed, at a world that seemed determined to punish him for every moment of happiness he'd ever stolen. The kid at the checkpoint, Joaquin, he'd said his name was, had just been unlucky enough to cross his path when the rage needed somewhere to go. Marcus remembered details he'd spent decades trying to forget. How the boy's hands had trembled as he'd handed over fake identification. How his voice had cracked when he'd insisted he was just visiting family in San Antonio. How he'd flinched away from Marcus's touch like a beaten animal. But there had been something else in that truck, more than just the obvious nervousness of a border crosser with falsified papers. The boy's eyes had kept darting to the truck bed, to something hidden beneath a tarp that Marcus had initially planned to ignore. Standard procedure was to wave through anyone who wasn't obviously carrying weapons or large quantities of drugs. The paperwork for a full vehicle search would have kept him at the checkpoint until dawn. Instead, he'd dragged the kid out of the truck and beaten him until those nervous glances turned to pure terror. Then he'd torn apart every inch of that vehicle, finding nothing but spare tools and a bag of stale tortillas. The humiliation had only made his rage burn hotter. "Please, senor," the boy had whispered through split lips. "I have family. My mother, she is sick. I just need work." Marcus had hit him again and again, until his knuckles were bloody and the boy was unconscious on the desert hardpan. Only later, when investigators from Washington arrived asking questions, did he learn what he'd really done. The hidden compartment in the truck's frame had been masterfully concealed, invisible to casual inspection. Inside were 20 kilos of pure heroin and detailed plans for a distribution network that would have flooded 3 states with poison. The boy's uncle, a man named Aurelio Guzman, had connections reaching all the way to congressional offices. Marcus had unknowingly intercepted the biggest drug shipment in Border Patrol history. The commendation should have been his. Instead, political pressure from Mexico City and Washington had branded him a rogue agent who'd exceeded his authority. The boy's beating became an international incident, a symbol of American brutality against innocent immigrants. The truth about the drugs never made the papers. That information was classified, buried in files that would remain sealed for 50 years. Marcus Rivera was quietly forced into early retirement with full pension, a scapegoat for policies no one wanted to defend publicly. But the drugs weren't the worst of it. The real cargo in that truck had been something far more valuable. Detailed intelligence about rival cartel operations, names and locations that would have allowed Joaquin's organization to eliminate their competition in a single coordinated strike. Without that information, they'd been forced into a war that had consumed thousands of lives over 2 decades. Marcus pulled out an old shoebox from beneath the sink, hands shaking as he opened it. Inside were newspaper clippings he'd collected obsessively over the years. Headlines about cartel violence in Juarez, body counts that climbed higher each month, photographs of mass graves discovered in the desert. And there, buried in a 3-year-old article about American overdose victims, was Carmen's name, listed among dozens of others who died from fentanyl-laced heroin traced back to Chapo's network. The thread connected everything. That night at the checkpoint hadn't just cost him his career, it had set in motion a cascade of violence that eventually claimed his own daughter's life. The boy he'd beaten had grown into a monster specifically because of that beating, shaped by humiliation into something far worse than he might have become otherwise. 42 hours and 37 minutes remaining. Time enough to count the dead. Not enough to bring any of them back. Marcus stared at the newspaper clipping until Carmen's name blurred into meaningless black ink. His daughter, dead from heroin, that had traveled the same route he'd once guarded. The circle was perfect, inevitable, cruel beyond measure, but something nagged at him, a discrepancy that had taken 23 years to surface. He pulled out his reading glasses and examined the article more closely. The date of Carmen's death, the hotel room number, the detective quoted in the story, Ray Vasquez, saying her overdose was part of a pattern they'd been tracking for months. Ray, who'd supposedly found her body. Ray, who'd held Marcus together at the funeral. Marcus set the clipping aside and reached for his laptop, fingers moving with growing urgency across the keyboard. The El Paso Police Department's public records database loaded slowly on his ancient machine. He searched for incident reports from 3 years ago, cross-referencing dates and locations. There it was. Carmen Rivera, age 32, found deceased in room 247 of the Desert Sands Motel. Cause of death, fentanyl overdose. Investigating officer, Detective Raymond Vasquez. But something was wrong with the timeline. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through old call logs, looking for the day Ray had contacted him about Carmen's death. There, March 15, 2021, 6:47 a.m. Ray had called to tell him Carmen was dead, that he'd found her the night before but hadn't wanted to wake Marcus until morning. The official police report was dated March 13th, 2 days earlier. Marcus's hands trembled as he cross-referenced the dates again. The newspaper article mentioned that Detective Vasquez had been tracking a pattern of overdoses for months. that Carmen's death was the seventh in a string of fentanyl-related fatalities, all young women, all found in cheap motels along the I-10 corridor. 7 victims. Marcus searched for the other cases, typing names from the article into the database. The pattern emerged like a constellation of horror, each case investigated by Detective Raymond Vasquez, each death occurring on nights when specific drug shipments had crossed the border. The room felt smaller, airless. Marcus grabbed his keys and stumbled out to his truck, needing movement, space to think. He drove aimlessly through El Paso's pre-dawn streets, past closed businesses and empty intersections, his mind racing through 25 years of friendship with Ray Vasquez. Ray, who'd always known exactly when to call after Carmen's arrests. Ray, who'd had inside information about which rehab centers had openings, which judges might show lenience. Ray, who'd been there for every crisis, every relapse, every moment when Carmen had needed help that never quite seemed to stick. Ray, who'd found Carmen's body but waited 2 days to report it. Marcus pulled into a 24-hour diner parking lot and sat with the engine running. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number containing a single photograph. Carmen at 17, laughing at her high school graduation party, Ray's arm around her shoulders in a gesture Marcus had always interpreted as brotherly affection. Now he saw something else in Ray's eyes. Something possessive, hungry. A second text arrived. She was so beautiful then, so trusting. Marcus's blood turned to ice. He called the number immediately, hands shaking as he pressed the phone to his ear. "Ah, Colonel Rivera." El Chapo's voice carried amusement, satisfaction. "I wondered when you'd start connecting the dots." "What are you talking about?" "Your friend, Detective Vasquez. Such a helpful man. Been supplying us with information for years. Raid schedules, witness protection details, evidence transfer routes. A very lucrative arrangement for everyone involved." The world tilted. "You're lying." "Am I? How do you think we knew exactly where to find your granddaughter? Who do you suppose told us about your daily routines, your financial situation, your guilt over Carmen's death?" A pause, heavy with malice. "Who benefits most from your current predicament?" Marcus closed his eyes, seeing Ray's tears at Carmen's funeral with new understanding. Not grief, guilt. The desperate sorrow of a man who'd helped destroy what he'd claimed to love. "He fed her the drugs," Marcus whispered. "Not directly. Detective Vasquez is far too clever for such crude methods. But he ensured she received our premium product, the kind that guarantees results." El Chapo's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. He loved her, you see, had loved her since she was a child. When she rejected his advances, chose addiction over his affection, he decided to help her find peace. The phone slipped from Marcus's numb fingers, clattering against the dashboard. 23 years of friendship, of shared grief, of believing Ray was the last good man in his broken world. "The assignment stands," El Chapo's voice continued through the speaker. 41 hours remaining. Bring us Detective Vasquez's badge, and your granddaughter lives. Though I suspect you'll find this task considerably easier now that you understand what kind of man you're dealing with." "Why?" Marcus managed. "Why tell me this? Because pain without understanding is just suffering. Pain with understanding becomes justice." A soft chuckle carried across the connection. "Welcome to the war, Colonel. You've been fighting on the wrong side for decades." The line went dead, leaving Marcus alone with the truth that rewrote everything he'd believed about his life. In the diner's neon glow, 23 years of memories crumbled like sandcastles at high tide. He remembered Ray at the hospital when Carmen was 12, reading to her after she'd broken her arm falling from a tree. How his eyes had lingered on her sleeping face just a moment too long. Marcus had thought it was compassion, the kindness of a man who'd never had children of his own. Ray volunteering to drive Carmen to school when Marcus was deployed. Ray showing up with pizza and homework help during her difficult teenage years. Ray always being there, always available, always the solution to problems Marcus was too busy or too broken to handle himself. "Jesus Christ!" The words scraped his throat raw. Every kindness had been calculated, every gesture of friendship a move in a game Marcus hadn't even known he was playing. His phone rang again. Ray's name on the screen felt like a slap. "Marcus? I just heard about Sophia." Ray's voice carried perfect concern, perfect urgency. "Channel 4 is reporting a possible kidnapping in your neighborhood. Tell me it's not—" "Where are you?" Marcus interrupted. "Home, but I can be there in 20 minutes. Have you called the FBI? They have protocols for situations like this." The performance was flawless. 23 years of practice had honed Ray's deception into an art form. Marcus could picture him now, probably sitting in his kitchen, Sophia's school schedule pinned to his refrigerator next to newspaper clippings about cartel activity he'd helped orchestrate. "I need to see you," Marcus said carefully. "But not at my place. Too many reporters hanging around." "Of course. The old checkpoint site off Highway 20? We can talk privately there." Even now, Ray was directing him toward isolation, toward a place where screams wouldn't carry. Marcus felt sick, realizing how many times he'd walked willingly into Ray's manipulations, grateful for the guidance. "I'll be there in an hour," Marcus said. "Marcus, wait. Whatever they've told you, whatever demands they've made, we'll get Sophia back, I promise." The sincerity in Ray's voice was perfect. If Marcus hadn't known the truth, he would have drawn comfort from those words, found strength in that unwavering loyalty. Instead, they felt like nails being driven into his daughter's coffin. Marcus hung up and sat in the parking lot, watching early morning joggers pass under streetlights. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that monsters walked among them wearing badges and uniforms and faces they trusted. His hands found the St. Christopher medal Carmen had given him for Father's Day when she was 8. "Keep you safe on your travels, Daddy." He'd worn it through 3 deployments, countless border patrols, every moment when death might have been waiting around the next corner. But safety had been an illusion all along. The real danger had been sitting at his kitchen table, eating his food, earning his trust. The medal's weight felt different now. Not protection, but accusation. He'd failed to keep anyone safe. Not the innocents whose drugs got through while he was beating a teenage smuggler. Not his daughter who died from poison delivered by her father's best friend. Not his granddaughter who was paying for sins that stretched back decades. But maybe that was the point. Maybe justice wasn't about protection anymore. Maybe it was about something simpler, more primal. An eye for an eye, measured in blood and betrayal. Marcus started the truck and pulled onto the empty highway, driving through the desert toward the checkpoint where everything had started. The irony was perfect, bringing Ray back to the place where Marcus had first chosen violence over procedure, rage over duty. The place where he'd learned that sometimes good intentions paved roads straight to hell. His phone buzzed with a final text from El Chapo. 39 hours, 43 minutes. "Your granddaughter sends her love." Attached was a video, 3 seconds of Sophia sitting in what looked like a warehouse, hands zip-tied, mouth taped, but alive. Her eyes found the camera with the same defiant spark Marcus remembered from Carmen at that age. Unbroken despite everything. The video ended with a close-up of Ray's detective badge lying on a concrete floor. The message was unmistakable: "Bring us that badge, or Sophia dies like her mother." Marcus pressed harder on the accelerator, the speedometer climbing past 80. The desert flew past in a blur of shadows and starlight, carrying him toward a reckoning 23 years in the making. Behind him, El Paso's lights faded into memory. Ahead, the checkpoint waited like an altar where he would finally offer the right sacrifice. The war El Chapo had spoken of wasn't beginning. It had been raging all along, claiming lives Marcus loved while he slept beside the enemy. Now it was time to pick a side and finish what that 17-year-old boy had started with his trembling hands and desperate lies. Time to discover what kind of man he really was when everything else was stripped away. The abandoned checkpoint materialized from the darkness like a monument to dead ambitions. Concrete barriers scarred by decades of desert wind stood at attention beside a rusted guard shack, its windows long since shattered by target practice and time. Marcus killed the engine and sat listening to the metal tick as it cooled, remembering the weight of his uniform, the authority he'd once believed in. Ray's sedan appeared 15 minutes later, headlights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. Marcus watched his oldest friend climb out of the car, noting how Ray's hand instinctively checked his service weapon, a gesture that had once seemed professional, now revealed as predatory instinct. "Christ, Marcus, you look like hell." Ray approached with arms outstretched, the same embrace he'd offered at Carmen's funeral. "We'll get through this. Whatever it takes." Marcus stepped back, keeping distance between them. "Like we got through Carmen's death?" Something flickered across Ray's features. Too quick to be natural. Too calculated to be surprise. "I know this is bringing up painful memories, but Sophia is different. She's alive, and we're going to keep her that way." "Are we?" Marcus pulled out his phone, displaying the video of Sophia bound and terrified. "Because according to El Chapo, you've already delivered exactly what he needed. My routines, Sophia's schedule, every detail that made her an easy target." Ray's face went still as carved stone. For 23 years, Marcus had interpreted that expression as thoughtfulness. Now he recognized it as the mask slipping, revealing the calculating mind beneath. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" "I know about the timeline discrepancies in Carmen's death report. I know about the pattern of overdoses you've been tracking and enabling. I know about the information you've been feeding to the cartels." Marcus's voice remained steady, each word placed with surgical precision. "The question is whether Sophia is already dead or if there's still something left of my friend worth saving." Ray laughed, a sound Marcus had heard countless times across kitchen tables and crime scenes, now transformed into something ugly and bitter. "Your friend? When was I ever your friend, Marcus? When you were deployed for months while I helped raise your daughter? When you came home drunk and broken, leaving me to pick up the pieces? When Carmen needed a father and found me instead?" The truth hung between them like cordite smoke. Marcus saw it all now, every kindness reframed as manipulation, every gesture of support revealed as grooming. Ray hadn't been helping, he'd been collecting, building a debt he intended to call in when Carmen came of age. "She rejected you," Marcus said. "So you killed her." "I loved her." Ray's hand drifted toward his weapon. "Everything I did was for love. The information I sold funded her rehab attempts. The drugs I let through kept worse things off the streets. The protection I provided kept her alive years longer than she deserved." "And when she still wouldn't come to you?" "She was going to die anyway. The addiction was too strong, the damage too deep. I just ensured it happened cleanly, peacefully. She felt no pain, Marcus. I made certain of that." The words hit like physical blows. Marcus felt 23 years of friendship disintegrating, replaced by a rage so pure it burned away everything else. Fear, doubt, the civilized restraints that separated men from monsters. "And Sophia? What's your justification for her?" "Chapo offered me a way out. Clean records, new identity, enough money to disappear completely. All I had to do was provide one last piece of intelligence." Ray's gun cleared leather with practiced ease. "But you had to start asking questions, didn't you? Had to dig up old graves." Marcus stood perfectly still, hands visible, unthreatening. "So this was always the plan. Sophia was just bait to get me here. Chapo wants you to understand. The boy you beat that night, he never forgot, never forgave. Everything that's happened since, every death, every drop of blood, it all traces back to your choice to let rage overcome duty." Ray's weapon stayed trained on Marcus's chest. He could have just killed you, but that would have been mercy. This way, you live knowing you destroyed everyone you ever loved. "Not everyone." Marcus smiled, expression devoid of warmth or sanity. "See, the thing about being a soldier, Ray, you learn to read terrain, to notice when someone's been digging." Ray's eyes flicked involuntarily toward the desert behind Marcus, where disturbed sand marked a fresh grave barely visible in the starlight. "Sophia's already dead, isn't she?" 3 hours ago. Quick, clean, professional, just like her mother. Ray's voice carried professional pride that made Marcus's stomach turn. "But Chapo wanted you to have hope first, wanted you to betray everything you believed in trying to save her." The rage that had defined Marcus for decades crystallized into something harder, colder. Not the wild fury that had destroyed his career, but the calculated violence of a soldier who'd found his enemy. "Then we're both free," Marcus said, and moved. Marcus moved with decades of training compressed into a single moment. He dove left as Ray's finger found the trigger, the muzzle flash illuminating the checkpoint like lightning. The bullet whined past his ear, striking concrete behind him as he rolled behind a barrier. "You think this changes anything?" Ray called out, his voice echoing off the abandoned structures. "She's still dead. They're all still dead because of you." Marcus stayed silent, circling through the shadows. Ray was right. Sophia was gone, Carmen was gone, and no amount of violence would bring them back. But something else moved through Marcus now, something that had nothing to do with salvation or redemption, pure arithmetic. A balance sheet written in blood that demanded payment. Ray fired twice more, concrete chips raining down as Marcus closed the distance. When he emerged from behind the guard shack, Ray spun toward him, weapon raised. Marcus caught his wrist, redirecting the barrel skyward as they grappled in the dirt. 23 years of friendship dissolved into primal combat, each man fighting for the right to walk away from the ruins of their shared history. The gun went off again, the report deafening in the desert silence. Ray drove an elbow into Marcus's ribs, breaking free, but Marcus was already inside his guard. His fist connected with Ray's temple, sending the detective stumbling backward toward the checkpoint's edge. "You destroyed my family," Marcus said, each word punctuated by another blow. "You fed poison to my daughter. You delivered my granddaughter to monsters." Ray tried to bring his weapon to bear, but Marcus grabbed it, fingers intertwining as they fought for control. The metal was slick with blood, whose Marcus couldn't tell anymore. Nothing existed except the weight of the gun between them and the look in Ray's eyes, no longer masked, revealing decades of carefully hidden hatred. The weapon discharged one final time, the barrel pressed between their bodies. Ray's eyes widened, then glazed. He toppled backward into the dust, the gun clattering away across broken asphalt. Marcus knelt beside him, watching blood spread across the checkpoint, where he'd first learned the price of letting rage override duty. "She loved you," Ray whispered, blood frothing at his lips. "Carmen, even when she hated everything else, she still loved her daddy." Then he was gone, leaving Marcus alone with the desert wind and the weight of what he'd become. 3 months later, Marcus sat in his truck outside Evergreen Cemetery as morning light painted the mountains gold. 2 fresh graves lay side by side under a cottonwood tree, Carmen and Sophia together at last, their headstones simple granite markers that said nothing about the violence that had claimed them. The El Paso Times had reported Detective Raymond Vasquez's death as a cartel execution, his body found at an abandoned checkpoint, with evidence linking him to years of corruption. The story wrote itself, a dirty cop who'd finally betrayed the wrong people. No one questioned Marcus's alibi or looked too closely at the timeline. Ray's crimes were too convenient a narrative for anyone to complicate with inconvenient truths. El Chapo had sent no more messages. Perhaps Sophia's death had satisfied whatever debt he believed Marcus owed. Perhaps killing Ray had balanced some cosmic ledger only the cartel understood. Or perhaps monsters simply moved on to other prey once their immediate hunger was satisfied. Marcus didn't care anymore. The rage that had sustained him for 23 years was gone, burned away in those final moments at the checkpoint. What remained felt hollow but clean, like a wound finally allowed to heal. He climbed out of the truck and walked to the graves, carrying 2 small American flags, one for his daughter, one for his granddaughter. The ritual felt important somehow, a recognition that they'd been casualties in a war that had started before they were born and would continue long after Marcus was gone. The flags fluttered in the desert breeze, bright patches of color against the brown earth. Marcus stood watching them dance, thinking about choices and consequences, about the weight young soldiers carried without understanding the mathematics of violence they'd been asked to perform. Somewhere in a federal prison, El Chapo was serving a life sentence, his empire reduced to memory and legend. Somewhere else, other young men in uniforms were making split-second decisions at checkpoints and border crossings, unaware of how those moments might echo through decades. And in El Paso, an old soldier turned security guard was learning to live with the silence that came after all the debts were paid. Marcus touched the St. Christopher medal at his throat, Carmen's gift from a lifetime ago. "Keep you safe on your travels, Daddy." He'd never been safe, he understood now. None of them had. Safety was the lie they told themselves while walking through a world where the past never stayed buried and every choice carried consequences they couldn't foresee. But maybe that was enough. Maybe surviving the war was victory enough, even if you lost everyone you'd been fighting for. Maybe peace was just another word for the exhaustion that came after the last battle was finally over. The flags kept dancing in the desert wind, and Marcus Rivera drove home.